Well, as I said earlier, we are beginning a series called New Beginnings. And as you can likely guess, we're going to start at the beginning with Adam and Eve. And maybe you're guessing too that we're going to start with their creation. There's a new beginning. Well, actually, we're not going to start with their creation because that's not a new beginning. That's just a beginning for them. We're actually going to look at a new beginning, something where they had to face something absolutely new in their lives, that they had to face momentous change. They had to face great upheaval. You can probably guess what I'm referring to. No, not Genesis chapter 1 with creation, but Genesis chapter 3 and 4, where we have Adam and Eve sinning, where we have the consequence of that happening, which includes getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Now there is a new beginning. There's a momentous change, a big upheaval, and it's a new beginning for Adam and Eve. And so I'm imagining that sometimes when we think of new beginnings, we automatically think of things like, I don't know, the birth of a child or a marriage, a wedding. These are new beginnings, yes, and those are times of momentous change too. But sometimes the new beginnings in our lives are things that we wouldn't describe necessarily as blessings. Maybe sometimes the momentous change that people face, they're things like losing a job, losing a relationship, or a big change in a relationship, possibly a divorce. For some, it's experiencing the death of a loved one. For others, it's a fire and the devastation that can bring in one's home. For others, it's hearing news about a family member. It's something big that happens in our lives that we wouldn't call a blessing, but we'd say, well, maybe with Adam and Eve, boy, this feels like a curse to us. This feels like a consequence of a fallen world. This does not feel like an exciting new beginning, but a scary new beginning. And haven't we all faced kind of a scary new beginning with this pandemic, with this COVID and the new reality that we're faced with? And as we had the new beginning way back last March in 2020 when it first hit and everything changed, and now things are slowly changing back, but so slowly, and so now we're facing other new changes, and oh, it's a big mess, isn't it? But it's a big upheaval, and really it's a new beginning for all of us, and a time of new beginnings. So we've all been facing this together. So what can we say about these new beginnings? Well, let's take a look at Adam and Eve. And as we take a look at Adam and Eve, we're going to see that there are 4 things that if they were to take a step back, that they could see are realities about their situation. There are 4 things that we can see in the big picture. So let's take a look at them as we consider Adam and Eve once they've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. What can we say is true about that new beginning? And here's the first one, is that Adam and Eve could say, whoa, we're still here. That would be an amazing thing for Adam and Eve to say, because remember the promise actually in Genesis chapter 2 where God says, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat of it you shall die. On the day you eat of it, you shall die. Now, some translations, I think, rightly translate that with the idea of you surely shall die. That the Hebrew is saying on the day that we get caught up in the technicalities of why didn't they die that particular day. Well, the Hebrew just uses language a little bit differently than we do. But certainly we can think of spiritual death coming into play. We can think of the fact of death coming into play. So on the day they ate of it, yeah, death did actually enter. However, it wasn't said to them, you will be kicked out of the garden, live for a while, and then you will die. It was just said to them, you will die. So perhaps they found themselves very much surprised and maybe with a sense of relief thinking, wow, we're still here. We're still here. So that's the first thing. But here's the second thing. They could say, God is still with us. We shouldn't think of God only hanging out in the Garden of Eden and would have nothing to do with them beyond that. In fact, as we look through Genesis chapter 4, now it doesn't speak about Adam and Eve so much, but here we have Cain. And Cain, of course, not just outside of the Garden of Eden, but also a murderer. And here God is as available to him as we see as he was with Adam and Eve in the garden. God is as available to Cain outside of the Garden of Eden as he was to Adam and Eve inside the Garden of Eden. And we see that with the conversation. God carries out a conversation with Cain. So that's something that Adam and Eve could say. We're still here, and God is still with us. That is an amazing thing and something to celebrate and to carry through life. So here's the third thing. There are signs of grace. There are signs of grace. We're still here, God is still with us, and there are signs of God's grace. The very fact that Cain and Abel came along. Remember the promise, on the day you eat of it, you shall die. But the next thing you know is, before there's actual death, there's new life given. The birth of Cain and Abel, and again, that's after the curse, that's after they leave the Garden of Eden. And in fact, right within the curse that God places on Eve as a consequence of the sin and the fall, notice what is said. Well, this is part of the curse. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. I know nothing about that, of course, but there's something very positive in those verses. Of course, the ladies who have given birth are saying, what's positive about that? Well, actually, what's very positive about that is the fact that there's the promise there that there will be children. There was the promise of death because of sin, but here we have, there has been sin, and now the consequence of sin, but even so, there's this promise of life and new life. There will be children, there will be future generations. God is determined to give life. There are signs of grace. That Adam and Eve can still go forth and multiply, just as God commanded them to do in Genesis chapter 1. It's all the signs of grace here. And so there are wonderful signs of grace. So we're still here. God is still with us. There are signs of grace. One more, there are opportunities. Now, again, we're not told a lot about Adam and Eve once they leave the Garden of Eden, once they're booted out. But you can well imagine that, in fact, they would have great opportunities that they never would have had before. For example, they would have the opportunity to learn to support one another in ways that they never had to before. Because before they were living in the Garden of Eden and things were pretty good in the Garden of Eden. Now they're no longer in the Garden of Eden and things are not as good. And when things are not as good, you need support from loved ones. And so here's Adam and Eve would have had this opportunity to, or this need rather, this opportunity to learn what it means to support one another. Also, tied in with that, they would have learned what it meant to lean on God more. In the Garden of Eden, again, things were good. Outside of the Garden of Eden, wow, did we ever need God? So there's another thing, the opportunity to learn to lean on God. So there's 4 things that we can look at when we think of Adam and Eve, that they could say, wow, we're still here. God is still with us. There are signs of grace, and there are opportunities here. Those are 4 things that are true of any new beginning. So how about when we face a new beginning, when we face a momentous change? Well, that's one thing, is we're going to look to Adam and Eve and learn those 4 things. But before we get there, let's learn something just from what life teaches us. And one thing is that when there's a momentous change, when there are new beginnings, whether they are exciting ones like the birth of a child, a wedding, or scary ones, and ones we'd say cursed, like health problems or those kinds of things, divorce, whatever it is, when there are momentous changes, when these things happen, there's a lot of stress that we go through. We go through stress, and so that's something we want to do, is to watch out for that stress. It may sneak up on us, and just living in this COVID world right now, we've all been under a lot of stress. So watch out for that stress and have strategies to deal with that stress. Things like eating well, sleeping well, paying attention to exercise, even breathing exercises can be a good thing, and prayer can be a part of that. Back out in the secular world, they'll speak about mindful moments, and we as Christians, prayer is certainly moments of mindful moments, and so a greater a greater seeking of the Lord because of the meditation aspect, but also, of course, because of the spiritual aspect of having God in our lives. So prayerfulness for us, but also even things like for stress relief hobbies. And I can attest to this summer that kayaking is a great hobby for a Baptist, for stress relief, and especially for a Baptist, because we do believe in full immersion, right? And yeah, so kayaking has turned out to be good for that. But anyway, so these stress can sneak up on us, so watch for our stress. But the other thing is that anytime there are big changes, including in new beginnings, there are losses, there are things we lose. And grief can sneak up on us. And so we want to be sure to be watching for grief too. Watch for things like anger that maybe we don't know where it came from. That can be a kind of a sign that we're grieving, and maybe we don't even know it. Denial. Sometimes people go into denial when there's change, and when big changes happen. So these are things to watch for and have strategies to cope with stress and also with grief. So that's one thing. But now let's go back to Adam and Eve and recognize that we too can take a step back and see the big picture when we're going through momentous changes, when we have new beginnings. And that begins with, we're still here. And just breathe a sigh of relief. Yeah, big changes, but we're still here. And you know what? Even if we weren't here, well, we can say with the Apostle Paul, he does in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, I think it is, it's better to be with the Lord than here in the body, but when that day comes, well, we'll breathe a sigh of relief then. But every morning till then, wake up and breathe a sigh of relief. Whew, we're still here. Second thing, God is still with us. And remember God's promise, very last verse in the Gospel of Matthew. And remember, I am with you always to the very end of the age. Remember that promise of God's presence. And sometimes we think of that presence as only being available to us when we are perfect children. Well, remember Adam and Eve, they were kicked out. Remember Cain was a murderer, and yet God was able to have a conversation with him. God is available to us, even when the big changes in our lives, even when the big new beginning is something really negative from our own doing even. God is still available to us, and we can seek his presence and seek, if there's sin in our lives that this big new beginning is something as a result of their sin, we can seek God's forgiveness and seek his strategy of working our way through it. We can seek God's presence through it. So that's the second thing. We're still here. God is still with us. But here's the thing, it's the third thing. There are signs of grace. And we might have trouble seeing those, but they're there. So one thing is to pray that we see more and more the signs of grace. And certainly we experience this morning a sign of grace when we participate in the Lord's table. The bread, the cup, these are symbols, these are signs actually of God's grace. That Jesus Christ actually is the greatest sign of God's grace we've ever had. It's like Jesus is this big signpost saying, God loves you, and God has grace for you. It's available for you. And so there's signs of grace. We want to have our eyes open for those. So here's the fourth thing, opportunities. And there are opportunities. Anytime there's big changes, anytime there are new beginnings, there are opportunities. And sometimes we have trouble seeing those, or sometimes we see them and we have trouble taking advantage of them. But they're there. So let's pray for the Lord to open our eyes to see the opportunities and to take those opportunities. And you know, sometimes those opportunities, sometimes they come later. That the big changes we go through, maybe struggle through, that can sometimes lead to opportunities for us to be a blessing to others in the future. So sometimes we aren't the ones that receive the blessing from it, but others receive the blessing from God through us. And because of the new beginnings we have faced, because of the momentous upheaval in our lives, others can be blessed. So watch for those opportunities. if I could just share a personal experience of seeing opportunities when there's a new beginning. We kind of had a new beginning when one of our sons came out as gay. And certainly that was a new beginning for him to start coming out to people and tell people, including us as parents, that he is same-sex attracted, that he's gay. And so that was kind of a new beginning for us. And when thinking about this new beginning, there are opportunities there. And there are opportunities to relate to our son in a way that's very honest and authentic, rather than relating to our son and he's trying to hide something from us. That therefore isn't an authentic relationship. So that's one opportunity, is to really grow into a more authentic relationship with our son. So that's a wonderful opportunity. Another opportunity is just walking this journey of understanding. Sometimes here's the narrative that's presented, is that a son comes out as gay to their Christian parents and the Christian parents kick the son out. Not in our home, absolutely not. That's not how it's going, but rather Sandra and I, we've been on a journey of learning and growing and understanding and seeking to walk with Jesus in faith, open love, and walking with our son. And so that's been a wonderful opportunity for learning and growth. And which leads to another wonderful opportunity, is just this opportunity to grow in ways that maybe I as a pastor in the future can help others in ways that I wouldn't have been able to before, because of the things that I'm learning and the ways that the Lord is growing me. For some people, if their child came out as gay to them, it would be like the end of the world. But actually, no. This was a new beginning. We're still here. God is still with us. There are signs of grace, and there are opportunities. So what new beginnings are you facing in life? And actually, we can talk about the church family. Every church family has faced new beginnings in this season of COVID and somewhat post-COVID. Well, what can we say as a church family? But we're still here. God is still with us. There are signs of grace, and there are opportunities. It's good to think through those four things. But what about you? What is a momentous change in your life? Maybe it is COVID. Maybe it is something else that you have been facing. Something a lot bigger has come into your life than the restrictions we have under this pandemic. Whatever it is you are facing, you're still here. God is still with you and available to you. There are signs of grace. Can you see them? And there are opportunities. Maybe someday you'll be willing to take them. Well, thanks for joining me as we explore some new beginnings along with Adam and Eve. And yes, big changes in our world, but here we are. We're still with us. God is still with us. There are signs of grace, and there are opportunities.